So I'm gonna face you a little more, Jane. Here we go.
All right.
I'm gonna face the music. That is Jane
Thank you
Dickson.
all for coming on a Saturday afternoon.
No, this is the most valuable time real estate possible. Your dry cleaning is gonna have to wait another day. If you can. So despite that introduction, if I can formulate a coherent question, that will be, a miracle, because I've got a whole Beatlemania thing going on right now. As I told you, Jane, there are thousands of screaming girls inside right now. I've been a fan for a minute. That show Barry Blinderman did that went up to the State of Illinois Museum. Now, Barry's in the house, so that's a key show. And the way that show, the way you hit in Chicago, the way the work resonated in Chicago, I think was quite particular. Given its the figuration in that town, the Harry Hoos. So you were embraced with open arms. I remember, Mike Lash couldn't stop. He was just like greatest painter ever. He was my co-worker at the time. And also then that I Living with Contradictions. I got a copy of Living with Contradictions really, somewhere around that time. Because I'm a big Lynn Tillman fan. So been a fan for a minute. But I thought we could, as an art historian, where to begin? Well, with art history, in a certain sense. I wanted to take a step, and especially given where you are now, stature-wise, career-wise, time has gone by, to think of, late 70s, your seminal paintings in the 80s, as in some sense closer to a particular period in American painting, regionalism, in a sense. They're almost closer to, I want to say, Reginald Marsh, and then, the George Tooker, Paul Cadmus, who were, I think Reginald Marsh actually taught them about tempera, I believe. But regionalism, and in particular Reginald Marsh, because I'm thinking of Reginald Marsh's New York, and so I know that people have, mentioned, perhaps Hopper, and that's cool. But the way I want to connect you to that regionalism, both by way of content, and it being New York and the seedy side, is also what you get when you take, I think, abstract expressionism in a way out of the picture, right? In terms of a certain trajectory of American art, the way it's dominated by the narrative of abstract expressionism, right? It's almost like, oh no, wait, I gotta blot out the sun if I actually want to see anything. Yeah, exactly. So, but I'm curious about, your perhaps latter-day reflections on the place of, what is now like something of a project in a sense, in relationship to that narrative. Do you see yourself in that kind of a lineage?
I'm from Chicago. I did grow up in awe of the Harry Who and figuration. I can admire Abex, but I was never drawn to do that. When I was young, I thought, when I'm older, I'll become more sophisticated and abstract. But I would, in school, I'd do an abstraction, then turn it upside down and be like, yeah, it looks okay to that. I didn't have a framework for abstraction. And I feel like I have, I'm very interested in mark making and material and process and color and many of the issues that abstract painting is engaging in, but I always was interested in content. And I have always used painting as my way of understanding my world, issues that I'm turning over. And one of them was, what is American? I grew up in Chicago, but my father was English. My grandparents lived in London, and when my parents were divorced, my mother moved to Paris when I was like 14 or so. And so I spent a lot of time there. And I always felt sort of like I had my nose to the glass in France. I learned to speak French, but I was always going to be an outsider. And even with my English grandparents, it was like, oh, these are our American grandchildren. And I'd think, well, what's so different about us? So, there are many reasons to make art and to appreciate art, and mine has always been somewhat anthropological and psychological. So I totally do admire Hopper. Reginald Marsh, I feel like we do intersect somewhat on subject matter, but he'll have these types like, oh, there's the sailor and there's the floozy, but if you don't feel them as individuals. They're kind of almost like architectural rendering figures, whereas, Hopper, it's like, I know what it feels like to be that woman sitting on that corner table.
You're right, alienation.
Nursing that cup of coffee. And so that's what I was taking from.
At that early on.
Yes.
In terms of, because I was wondering about, what your awareness in the late 70s and early 80s would have been of that regionalism in some sense.
I was very aware of it.
Yeah, and thinking about like, is there, and has that view of that regionalism changed over time?
Well, being interested in that work and being a figurative painter in the 70s was like saying that you had a contagious disease. People would be like, oh, really? I have to go talk to that person over there. And I went to art school for a year at the Beaux-Arts in Paris, and there they were like, painting, we did that already, it's done. You can't, it was that, I went there in 1970, so it was only 2 years after May 68, and people were manifesting in the streets and throwing paint out the windows and anything but paint, it's like, look in the Louvre, we've done it, it's finished. You're crazy. But God knows I persisted.
Yeah.
I even tried to stop at various points, but I couldn't. And now I guess I'm glad I didn't.
Well, there's a great, perhaps one of the interviews, and it was either an interview or it could have been the chronology that's in the back of the new book. And it was very beautiful. You said, it reminded me of this great anecdote about Martin Scorsese getting a contract with Columbia Pictures, relatively soon out of graduate school. And he produces Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Boxcar Bertha. I think he does 3 films under his contract with Columbia. And he invites his hero, John Cassavetes, to come to one of the screenings. And I think it may have been Boxcar Bertha. And John Cassavetes walks up to him right after the screening and just says to him, "Don't you ever, ever, ever do that again. You do what you know. Do what you know." And then it's like, and it just undid Martin Scorsese. And then it's like, you get mean streets, taxi driver. Like, I feel like it's like, yeah, we all need friends and heroes like John Cassavetes to come up to us and like lay down the law, you know, in a sense. But I liked reading that, you had a quote where you said, there was a certain point in which you said, I have to do what I know, you know. And it didn't, I decided to do what I know and stick with that. And I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about when was that point? And what may have triggered that resolve?
It was around the time that I did Living with Contradictions, which was probably 78. And I had studied printmaking in college much more than painting, because at that point in art school, people just kept saying, oh, do whatever you want. Go ahead, do whatever you want. And I'd be like, I don't even know where to start. That's not very helpful. But printmaking, there was a whole technical thing they could teach you. So I had done a lot of printmaking in school. And early on, as soon as I got to New York, I started meeting exciting artists. I was working for this animator, Susan Pitt, and through her I met Red Grooms and that whole circle, and then I met Charlie, who's my husband, and he had been at the Whitney program, so I feel like I got Whitney program by proxy, because the Whitney had talked him out of being a painter. He went in as a painter. They told him it was dead. And he went on to become a filmmaker. And so he was like, I know a lot about painting. Let me spell out a few things for you. So he was very generous. Now I just lost my point.
Oh, no. Yeah, the moment that you decided to do what you know.
Oh, so yeah. I was in New York and I actually tried to set up still lifes in my loft in Tribeca and paint the pillows because I didn't have anything else around. And I was like, and then I got this job working on the first digital light board in Times Square, at one Times Square where they dropped the ball on New Year's Eve. And to rest my eyes, I'd look out the window and be like, oh my God. So I started sketching what I saw out the window, and I was like, this is so much more interesting than the pile of pillows I have in my loft. Come on. So that was the moment when I went, okay, I'm gonna use painting to research things, and then I'm gonna paint what I'm learning. But the first thing that I did was, I guess, Living with Contradictions was maybe before I started working in Times Square. I was like, so what do I know? If I'm just gonna make art only about things that I know, what do I know something about? And I thought, well, my women friends and I spend an awful lot of time talking about guys and like, what do guys want? So I did this set of monoprints and I just moved in with Charlie about what it's like groping around to be a couple. And then Lynn lived around the corner from us. We lived on Fulton Street. She lived on John Street. And I invited her over. I was renting an office on John Street as a studio. And I was like, Lynn, what do you think of these images? Someone's offered to make a book of them. I would like to have some text. Can you think of a story to go with them? So it was the first thing that Lynn ever published.
Oh, really?
It's the first thing she ever published, and people always think that I illustrated her book, but really,
it's the other way around.
She wrote a text to my book.
Oh my God. Wow.
I've had such a great career of recognizing people before the world recognized them.
I mean, I love the fact that I'm one of those people who, instead of reading, if you put things like a chronology in the back or whatever, it's like, I'll probably read the chronology before I read any of the essays in there, because there's more where like juicy tidbits are. But the fact that you called Creative Time when the billboard project, or the light board project they brought back the project that you had initiated with the thing. And in the chronology it says, Dickson calls them to tell them that she was the curator of the first one. And I was just like, there you go, claim your shit. Like, just so you know.
Well, at the time that I did curate it, I wanted to be in it as well as curate it, which was really considered uncouth in 1980. So I was like, I will make this happen if I get to pick the artist, and I'm one of them.
Yeah.
But I didn't think of myself as a curator, and I wasn't aiming to do a career as a curator, so I thought, I don't care about getting credit as the curator. And the Public Art Fund at that point was just Jenny Dickson, who was Doris Friedman, who had founded the Public Art Fund, was in a coma, but she hadn't died yet. And so Jenny was this young woman who was her assistant, who was suddenly running shit, but she didn't really know what she was doing either. So it was just the two of us. The idea that it would be, that anyone would be talking about that project all these, 40 odd years later did not occur to either of us. And so there aren't really very good records of it.
Right. I mean, but the roster of artists, I mean, even if that were the only record of it, and when it was done, but when you do, and I took note instantly, and I'm glad that they did make note of what I noted instantly. It was just like, of course, you're reading through it on Times Square, just like, Jenny Holzer, she's in the mix. And it is like, yes, if you were wondering, this is Jenny Holzer's first time using LEDs as a one effect. So when you do a project, it's like, if only for that, the project's value lives on. It's quite
Jenny
beautiful.
was printing her slogans on paper cups and flyers, and
wheat paste.
I had been working on this computer billboard for several years, and my colleagues were coming out to LA to start early special effects companies, and they invited me to come with them, but I had to learn BASIC, because there were no user programs yet for digital art. And I looked at the BASIC book for a couple of days and went, shoot me. So I knew I was gonna, and so then the sign offered me to become the art director, and I was like, oh, I could have a career as a designer, art director, but I really want to paint. And at the same time, Patty Astor opened Fun Gallery and offered me a solo show in the East Village. And it was the first gallery in the East Village, so people would go, you're having a show where? East 10th Street? There are no galleries over there. But it was a legendary lineup. I was the only woman who ever showed at Fun Gallery.
But that's it. I mean, that, and again, you as a way to think about the 1980s, and on the one level there are its sanitized narratives of the 1980s, in some sense, But going back and just seeing, and then there are the less sanitized narratives of the 1980s. And when I think of the pictures generation, right, is one of the more dominant narratives of the 1980s, and this issue about, its link in some sense to a critique of images and the role that somebody like John Baldessari would play, right? So to think of them in no small part is like, okay, in some sense, both literally and otherwise, as the children, there's some kind of thread from conceptual art into the pictures generation, right? But when I think about you and working with Lynn, there's also a collaboration between Robert Kushner and Kathy Acker, where they did the Persian dictionary one, and then Richard Bozeman working with John Giorno, in which case it's like words and pictures, or the issue about being an illustrator comes into play. So it isn't just like the pictures generation and a critique of images, but you guys are just like flat out storytelling. And that's like, I felt like it's like, oh no, let's bust this back a notch, all right? So when you go into that less sanitized version, you get into areas of narrative, like unabashed, plain, straight up, right? You know, no equivocating about it. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where lines may have been or may not have been in terms of camps and cliques, perhaps. Yeah.
Cindy Sherman lived across the hall from us at 64 Fulton Street. We shared a bathroom down the hall. She lived with Nancy Dwyer. And the art world was small in those days. So we were friendly. You know, I'd go to parties and there'd be Kim Gordon. Was going to do a piece with a telephone. I remember she kept telling me about her telephone. I was part of CoLab, but CoLab was, you know, there were people like Jenny and Peter Naden who were much more, there was a conceptual wing of CoLab, and I've always treasured that. Like, you know, when I came to New York, came to LA, the person I hung out with was Liz Larner.
Yeah.
You know, I have a lot of friends who are abstract, conceptual, minimal artists, and I have more dialogue with them, I would say, than other figurative painters. I'm not in the like, yeah, we can, you know, talk brushes, and I think that wing of representational painting for its own sake can be as boring as anything else. Right. And I'm interested in art that takes the culture forward, and I want to engage in the dialogue of my time, that just these are my tools.
Right. But it's interesting that you would mention you having a relationship with artists who are, you know, perhaps, you know, seemingly a diametrical opposite to you. But I have to say that there is, and I would actually teach your paintings. I taught a painting critique theory seminar at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I would teach your paintings as like, and we would use Marcia Tucker's Bad Painting show as kind of like the core, right? 1977. And then I would be like, it's like, okay, that's the show, but let's read this essay, you know, and this is a period piece, so I would show slides, you know, by the artists who were in there. And then I would say, okay, now let's expand. It's like, who got left out of this in a weird way, in an interesting way? But, you know, so I teach.
I wasn't bad enough.
You're right, right. You, Martin Wong.
I loved Martin.
Martin Wong, right? So just thinking, but I'd have to, the minute that I would use that show more as a kind of scaffolding to hang these painters on, I would stop whenever I would begin to show your slides and say, no. There's one thing about seeing reproductions of Jane Dixon's paintings, you know, but then there's Jane Dixon in the flesh.
Or in the AstroTurf.
Yeah, in the right, which is pretty fleshy.
Yeah.
And I would take this issue's scale that would go on, but because of she's put constraints, there are technical constraints on her choice of materials in terms of how much resolution she can get out of something. But there's a solemnity going on in the paintings. Compositionally, there's a quiet, there's a sense of reflection and mood that has more to do, like the geometry of them and how they're structured actually has a lot to do with minimalism, I would say, in terms of a certain set of choices that you make about how, like, on the one hand, the content, yeah, it could be low down, tawdry, but there's another thing going on in them at a level. I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about composition, essentially, or structuring it so that there is another kind of resonant, reflexive quality going on in the paintings.
Yeah, when I look at this, first of all, most of this show is from 2000, and the small ones are from the mid-90s. So when I look at them now, I'm like, oh, there's a little bit of Rothko in these paintings.
Oh, and they're hung low. And so there's something weird about the hanging height. So the horizon line is down, and it puts me up. And so it has this other, like, it's like, is everybody here driving into the afterlife? Yeah. or maybe it's also a serial quality to them.
I did these, I actually was really ill, and I didn't know it yet, or I hadn't been diagnosed yet, but I think I knew it somewhat subconsciously, so it really was sort of driving off the cliff.
Interesting. Interesting.
Because after I did these, I was really ill and I didn't paint at all for a couple of years. And I had called this series Out of Here, because I was like, I've had it, I gotta get out of here. And then I did some bargaining with my maker and went, I didn't mean it that way.
I was like, wait, which here are you referring to that you wanted out of? Did you mean like below 8th Avenue here? Or did you mean like, the Tribeca here? Which here?
And I did these right before 9/11, and we lived down near the World Trade Center, so our world just completely imploded at that point, and I didn't paint for a couple of years. And then I was like, I'm going to have a whole new attitude and be much more cheerful. Like these two that are from this summer.
I have to say, my real gut response to your, which just makes me, tickles me to no end when things hit at a certain frequency that I just can't. Your work, I feel like it's like, oh no, you could take Jane Dickson to Shangri-La, and I don't know if the paintings are gonna change. It's like she's gonna find I don't know what she's gonna find in Shangri-La, but is it gonna happen? Is it dusk, twilight? You can't rinse it out. The kind of, I guess, mood. So when you say that these are the cheery ones, it's like. But again, somebody did make note of the fact that time of day is important to you, that these are twilight. There is an attention to that.
It is a time of day that I am drawn to. I mean, my Times Square work was all at night because that's when, first of all, I worked the night shift on weekends, so that's the time I was mostly there, but that's when the lights come on and everything looks amazing, and in the daytime everything looks trash-filled and pathetic. And what I loved with my early work was that I could just go, oh, well, I'm only gonna paint the things I wanna paint, and anything else, oh, that's in the shadows, forget about it. I would just, a lot of times I do take a lot of photos and I do paint based on my photos. I'm really not a photorealist. I feel free to modify anything that I want to get closer to the feeling that I remember from when I took the picture. Again, I've just lost whatever was the last part of that sentence.
No, but it's interesting. I mean, when I was talking about the material constraints, just because of the ground that you use, right? The mark that you can't, the level of resolution, and I think of that as forcing a sense of editing, in terms of how much detail, and also the fact that when you started with the oil stick, they only came in 6 colors, right? So that's another kind of constraint.
Which I loved, because before that, when I was trying to learn to paint, they make so many colors, and I'd be like, blue, oh, do I want cobalt blue, or ultramarine blue, or phthalo blue? And especially the blues don't talk to each other. So I've done some paintings to prove myself wrong and go, yes, I can use ultramarine and phthalo, but in fact, it's like having 2 different radio stations on at the same time. They're just, so limiting my palette, so there was only 1 blue and 1 green it gave the works a unity that you, as a more experienced painter now, I have 100 colors of oil stick and, you know, tubes of every color of paint that exists. And I feel like I can, I feel like it's more like trying to conduct a symphony, whereas my earlier work, it was like chamber music. It was like, we're just gonna have a couple of options here and they will harmonize, because if I want purple, I have to mix this blue and this red. And so that purple will relate to the red and blue that it came from.
Right.
Unlike with the whole universe of colors, you can be like, oh my God, that orange doesn't relate to anything here, it just jumps out.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to shift gears in a funny way, but as a segue to something you said about Times Square at night versus Times Square at day. You know, a friend here, Matthias Poledna, artist, he said, and Matthias is Austrian, and Matthias, he said, LA, really, it looks like shit when it rains. LA, nothing without the sunshine. And I've never forgotten that you know, that observation. So I think about that all the time. It rains here. But thinking about you in LA, and what I was saying, like, that's a version of you coming to Shangri-La. It's like, oh no, it's not gonna be pretty, you know, in a certain sense.
Sorry.
But the issue is like not knowing, you know, where's the sun in your LA paint, you know?
The semester that I came here to paint LA was El Nino. So it was raining the whole time. I wasn't waiting for it to rain. It was like I was teaching in Cal State Northridge, and that's what the parking lot looked like. And I was teaching a night class, so I'm pulling up, it's sunset, I'm going in to teach my class. And I kept going, I thought it was gonna be warm, I'm freezing, and it's gray and rainy, but I feel like really early on, I think it was Charlie's uncle turned to me and said, "What's the inspiration for your painting?" And I immediately just blurted out, fear. And I think it's still true. Like, you know, I would love it if I was Matisse, and I adore his work, and if I could be all about, you know, calm luxe and whatever that last one was, volupté, I would be so happy, but that's not who I am. And I feel like everybody has a certain range in us.
Right.
This is what the frame that we experience the world through, and you know, fear is my bottom line. Charlie can certainly back me up on this. I'm one of the jumpiest people you'll ever meet, and so I'm always scanning the horizon for what the next catastrophe is going to be, and I think I do that with my work. I mean, when I did these, I was thinking of them as commentary on the highwayscape and, you know, contemporary nature paved over, and I wasn't consciously thinking, oh, they're all going to be twilight. And actually, some of them are not here, but one of the earliest ones was all clear on the Dan Ryan, and it's full daylight, and we used to have it hung up next to our couch, and my kids, when they'd be lying there watching TV, they would pat the painting. It's like it was a dog. And they did that for years, and it didn't ruin the painting. So I was like, oh good, these are pretty sturdy.
Stable. But I've only seen reproductions of the Dan Ryan painting, and I know the Dan Ryan too well, more than I want to know. It's like a strip of expressway, you know. So I looked at it and I was like, I think I know where she did it. I think I know where this is, you know.
And I was just remembering that my very first highway pictures were watercolors that I did in high school of highways in Chicago. And my mother framed one and had it up in her living room. And she said somebody she knew who was an artist came over and went, "Who did that piece? That person is very disturbed." And there is a level on which I think I started making art kind of as an SOS to my parents. Like, it's really difficult over here, but so she goes, "People think this person thought you were really disturbed," but it did not engender any further conversation like, "What's bothering you?" No, she was just like, "Oh, I hear you're really disturbed." So I've been, working out my problems in paint ever since.
No, but it's funny to think about you coming, bodies of work. I was talking just casually mentioned with Barry a few minutes ago. In terms of stylistic development, right? Like, it's like, no, it's not. It never strikes me as that as much as like, oh no, you talk about it like, oh, there were these paintings, and then she did circus, then she did, the Crash Derby stuff, then state fairgrounds, in Vegas in a way. But but there also might be at a certain point it feels like there might be mixing and matching or going back, in there. But with the dream houses, I can't remember the body of work, the first, the name that it had. I remember seeing them, and one came up as LA, and that was a clue, because some of them I was like, well, suburbs, like, just the suburbs, but the palm tree gave it away, and I thought, wait a minute, where is she? Where are you? Where are you going when you make these? So, Times Square, a particular time and a particular place. When, in terms of perhaps travels, do you think of then expanding your scope to a grander kind of narrative about the American dream? And did that come about? When did that come about?
So I guess I always have a million ideas and I want to go off in a million directions, but at a certain point I realized when I had a dealer over and I was like, and here's my paintings, and I'm also painting on fans, and I'm doing animation. I was like, I could see that I was losing him, and I was like, okay, for right now, just paint Times Square. And then every time I'd get another idea, I'd go, you can do that later, but just finish this body of work. I would talk to myself like I was a 4-year-old, because that is the part that is creative, that wants to go, oh, but now I have a great idea. Let's go do this, and let's get out the tinfoil and make funny hats and start knitting and just do everything. Maya's laughing because she works with me, and I periodically am like, and what if we do giant sculptures? And she's like, let's just finish this thing. So I did. It was with a certain struggle that I stuck to time, but I also knew that the Times Square I was painting, our building was condemned. Before we moved in, we were there for 12 years. It was condemned the whole time, and ceiling was leaking, and the elevator didn't work, but it made it cheap for us to live there, but we knew we were on borrowed time. So it was like, just do Times Square. This is going to be historical in a short while. It's just everyday life out the window right now, but it is going to be gone. And then then when I got pregnant the first time in '86, I couldn't stand the smell of Times Square. It made me throw up. So I was like, I don't want to look at it. I can't paint it. So I was like, I'm gonna go to the demolition derbies. That's out in the fresh air. And I painted demolition derbies, which those actually do sort of relate to ABEX. They're gestural.
Yeah.
They're very gestural. And on one level, they could be read, I felt them as, they were a commentary on American society and our love of cars and our love of speed and our love of destruction. But on a personal level, I also felt like they were about my professional life and my personal life as a mother crashing into each other. Like the week that my son was born, the Met bought a big painting, and Kinniston McShine, who was at MoMA at that point, was like, oh, I want to take you out to dinner to celebrate. And I never did that, and then I was like, oh, my breasts are leaking. And I couldn't cope. I was like, wake me when this is over. So that's when I did the demo derbies, because I was like, am I gonna stay home and mash baby food, or am I gonna wheel and deal with the big boys in the museums? And at that moment, I couldn't really deal with the big boys.
But I guess I feel like because it even though you left Times Square as a subject, I mean, obviously, spectacle culture, right? The state fairs, the circus, demolition derbies. But I guess what I was getting at is like the scope of, I guess, Times Square, site of desire, right? And then even at the base of the American dream, it's the same thing, the site of desire and disappointment, I guess, right? Or expectations or something. So it's really it's just more like, where do you want to park it? As the question, rather than, so I guess I answered my own question, in that regard. But it felt like it was a move somehow out, like you just cast a net, across the whole country, at a certain point. I thought may have been a shift, just wondering was it that you were traveling? What inspired that? It sounds like it was more happenstance.
I was from Chicago, so I thought, well, I've been in New York and I've captured New York, but I'm not only a New Yorker, and I wanted to address my Midwestern roots and the big sky and the highways. Somebody at the opening, some young artist was like, these really feel Midwestern to me. And like I said, one of the first ones was the Dan Ryan. But when Barry did this wonderful mid-career survey with me in, was it 93? 93. Right before that show opened, I broke my painting hand fairly badly. So I had it in a cast, and I couldn't paint for 6 months. So I went and saw my work in 4 or 5 different iterations with my arm like this in a cast. So I felt like at the time I was painting strippers as we were leaving Times Square, and I was like, I'm in the middle of painting strippers. And then 6 months later, having done the tour with this show, which was in Normal, then it was in Chicago, then it was in Arizona, and then it was in
Memphis?
Long Beach. So I was out around the country, and I took photos everywhere. I take photos everywhere I go.
Tour of the show, right.
And then after I got the cast off, usually you make a body of work, and then you make the next body of work from the last one. But having stopped painting for 6 months and had this opportunity to see all my previous 15 years of work, it all seemed equally accessible and equally inaccessible. So it started to feel like instead of a long tail of segments, that it's become a spiral, and I could enter back in at various points.
Right.
That what I was doing with the strippers 6 months before was as remote as things I had done 10 years before.
Right.
And I've since then done lots of new work. This was right after these highways sort of came out of that road show. But I've made new work, but then I also have delved back into earlier series because I feel like pretty much every series I've done has been interrupted either by health issues of mine or just life issues. So as I look back on what I've done, I'm like, oh, I meant to do 3 more of those. And I remember what I was gonna do. And I think it's my history, it's my life and art. And so I can make these ones that are part of this series,
Right.
even though it's 20 some years later. And these are acrylic and the earlier ones are oil.
Right.
And I've been really interested in the then and now. My goal was to document my time, my world as I saw it as a woman, just the dailiness of it. But now a lot of it, I'm old enough that it's become sort of historical.
Oh yeah.
So that's a really, that's an interesting thing to look back on. And, I thank my younger self for taking lots of photos so that I could pull out these photos and go, oh yeah, I had a great drawing of this, but I never made the painting of Smog Check. So now's the time, why not?
I love thinking of you as, squarely with the Times Square paintings, you're a history painter. Like whether you wanted to be or not, just because of circumstances that it was a discrete date, Dinkins, Times Square is getting redone. And you knew it, like you said, we're on borrowed time in this area. Or circling back and looking at this painting with the date at the car and the date of the painting do not square, in a certain sense. But I think of this as having another kind of commentary on photorealism. Funny enough, which is like, because the cars in photorealism become a weird means of dating it somehow, and then when does photorealism, Robert Bechtel, I was interested in when does photorealism have a psychology, and then when doesn't it? It's like a light switch. Like one painting can have a psychological thing going on, and then the next one it doesn't. It goes.
Well, Bechtel, I love him. His work does have a psychological.
Yeah, right. And locating it is really hard, but it's there. It's like, is it in the hubcaps?
It's in the selection of the original photo, and he's always, or often, there's like his family standing in front of the family car.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of photorealists, it's like, look, Mom, I can paint, and you're like, great, you can paint, but then what do we care about what you painted? I can paint shiny surfaces and neat diners. That to me sort of gets into kitsch.
Yeah, but Vegas stood out talking about your returns, like you saying, oh, wait, I remember there were 3 more paintings I had to do about this series, and I can still go back there. Vegas felt like a really pointed return of sorts, to Times Square, but not. It was almost like, oh, Times Square is part of New York. It was a bubble, and even though it's for all this notoriety in a certain sense, whereas just the idea of Jane Dickson in Vegas is like, uh-oh, this is her being unleashed on a town, suddenly where it's like,
Alitash took me to Vegas. It was right after we had moved out of Times Square, and I was like, okay, I'm a mom in Tribeca. What am I going to paint now? And Alitash said, we've got to go to Las Vegas. It'll be great.
I love this. That it's like, it's all happenstance. Like, you know, that
Well, I think it's partly being somehow aware to take in when, you know, I think life is just happening and you focus on certain things and go, and when I kept going, oh, Tosh, I don't want to go to Vegas. I hate gambling. I'm afraid of gambling. But she's like, no, we're going to have a great time. And at first I got there and went, I hate this place. And then I was like, oh. The same thing happened when we always tried to not be in Times Square on New Year's Eve because I really don't like big crowds of drunks. So we would, every year we'd go away on New Year's Eve because where we lived in Times Square, you would be trapped. Either you were in or you were out for the 24-hour period where people are on those horns that sound like a dying sheep. And one year we couldn't leave because they thought I was having a miscarriage, which I didn't. My daughter is now 35. But the doctor was like, you can't go anywhere. You're hemorrhaging, stay here. So I put a pillow over my head at 9 p.m. and thought, I'm just gonna sit it out. I hate all this. And then suddenly I went, I hate all this. Quick, get all my film out of the freezer. I have to go photograph it. So then I did a whole series of New Year's Eve paintings based on the happenstance that we were there because I thought I was having a miscarriage. So yes, my life is somewhat filled with the things that bother me are things that I need to explore. And on one level, all my New Year's Eve revelers, while it has the same thing of hope and disappointment, the other thing about it was that because that's all figures, and drunk people are falling all over each other, or they're pulling each other, or they're pushing each other, so they're physically expressing their relationships. And, you know, I didn't realize this as I was doing them. These are all retrospective ahas. But suddenly I went, oh, I had little kids at that time. And so this idea of how people relate to, you know, there's like pictures of people ignoring their kids in Times Square. There's a little person trailing along, dad strolling like, and I'm like, you're in Times Square. It's New Year's Eve. Hold your damn kid's hand. Don't just lose them in the, but people are like, you know, you go, okay, he's really expressing what kind of dad he is to his tiny tot. So it was all about relationships, that series. And then what Las Vegas turned out to be is, it's a physical manifestation of the internet. It's all set up to make you get confused and lost. You think, I'm just going down the elevator to the parking lot to get my car, and then an hour later, you bought 5 tchotchkes, and you got a drink, and you're watching somebody gamble, and you never found the parking lot, much less your car, because they make it so that you think, I'm just gonna go down, I'm gonna take a right, I'll be in the garage. You take a right and you're in the swimming pool because nothing is a right angle and the light is, and I had been just thinking about how when like I'm sure everyone else, you're like, I'm just gonna get on the phone for a second and text my friend, and then again, a half an hour later, you've saved some whales and bought some shoes and read about a terrible murder. And you're like, oh shit, my friend, I forgot. So I was like, how do I paint that? Yeah. And I feel like what I've done with Las Vegas is I've done the small studies like what we have back there because I didn't know what the material should be to do the larger versions. And now I have the roll of red felt that I'm gonna
Oh, you're gonna go back to it? You're gonna,
yes, I have to do the bigger version, which I think means I have to actually go back to Vegas also because I haven't been there now in a while. I want to update my Vegas experience.
I love this because it just sounds like the way you keep circling around certain things or happenstance, the role that it would still play makes for, you know, in some sense, a career, if not life, that sort of rhymes?
Well, we're trying, you know, I mean, we're all trying to make some sense.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm doing with my paintings too. Hopefully.
Well, thank you.